Shariram Nitriyam Pranam Sadgurubhyoni Vedayam Atmajaratiyam Sarvam Sadgurubhyoni Vedayam Guru Gita Vasna Vishta Gurugam Dimam Bhuttam Shrishnarakam Sachamam Sampuram Jayanam Nare Samsara Vrukshamarida Patantunavartanare Venatyo Vitan Sarve Tasmai Shri Gureva Guru Brahma Guru Vishnu Guru Devo Maheshwara Gurudeva Parabrahma Tasmai Shri Gureva Etave Jagatameva Samsaranam Sasetave Brahmave Sarvavidyanam Brahmave Gureva Anyana Kiminandasya Jnanam Janashalakala Chakshurminitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gureva Pitam Tvam Chademata Brahman Chadevata Samsara Pratipurnartam Tasmai Shri Gureva Yat Satyena Jagat Satyam Yat Prakashena Atmika Yadanande Ananandi Tasmai Shri Gureva Yasya Satyam Idam Dharmadevam Dhuvata Iyam Sutta Yasvidya Tasmai Shri Gureva Yena Chitayate Idam Chitam Chitayate Nayam Jagrat Swapna Shishityadi Tasmai Shri Gureva Yasya Jnana Vidam Vishvam Nadrishyam Vinatevata Sarikaruparupaya Tasmai Shri Gureva Yasyantam Satyam Yasyam Hello. Can you shift over just that so I can see your face and eyes? Joe, you stay where you're at. Yes, please. You okay? Hi, I'm not the G. Welcome. Very happy to be here with all of you and to start this program for the year. This, I think you're all aware, this is a 4-module program that'll go on all year. The format generally of each evening will be last about 2 hours. We will have some short introduction, then we will do a meditation, and then I'll do some discourse and we'll do a question and answer. Pretty much each time we meet, then I will lead some guided meditation. And those meditations will correspond to the different stages of sadhana that we're exploring. Let's see if I can. What we want to do here. So this program is designed around mostly around my experience of practicing spiritual work for 50 years and teaching 49 of those. in the process of that, maybe 20 years ago, I began to study what one might call wisdom teachings, the teachings of Kazimir Shaivism, Trika Shaivism, known by many names, but basically non-dual practices. And I did that primarily in order to be able to articulate my own experience in a way that meant that I was really speaking from my own experience, but finding that experience in these ancient teachings, and to be able to articulate my own practice, my own experience within those teachings, so that I couldn't be accused of making all of it up. And also because this spiritual and philosophical framework that really emerged between the 8th and the 12th century in non-dual practices, and was primarily an oral transmission up until that point, and then began to be written down by great masters, by truly great masters in Eastern Indian tradition. What became clear to me in doing so was a number of things. That the teaching that I had received from my guru, which is Swami Rudrananda, who never talked about tradition, never read a book on spiritual practices in his life, that this extraordinary teaching that he had given me in a very short period that I knew him physically, which was about 18 months, that as I began to study these wisdom traditions, it was like, oh, that's what he meant. His guru, our Satguru, which is this man named Bhagavan Nityananda, is even today considered one of the great modern Mahasiddhas in India. He passed in 1961. And he again, didn't really teach from scripture. He taught from experience. He taught from his own presence. But he, like Rudy, focused on one fundamental thing, and that was the liberation of Kundalini yoga, of Kundalini, through the practice of Kundalini sadhana. So what I've done in this program is to marry a few things. One is to marry my own experience and the teachings that I received with these wisdom teachings of the tradition that, while we early on didn't recognize that we were part of that tradition, were the expression of the practice that I've been given. So what we will see, as we'll talk at length about the practice of Kundalini sadhana, which is the focusing on the practicing of the awakening and liberation of Kundalini within us, which we'll explore in depth. That there's a progression to that experience, there's a progression to that liberation, and those are called upayas. Upayas means means. And the non-dual tradition, many traditions, some of them non-dual, some of them dualistic, but many Eastern-based traditions talk about upayas as means. And those means really describe the progression of our experience, the progression of the awakening of our own consciousness. There are three fundamental means, which I'll go over in a minute, but basically the path of effort, the path of the individual, the path of energy, and the path of awareness, which describes that unfolding of consciousness within us. And so what I've done, and we'll look at this in a moment, is created a matrix of how the practices, the aspects of our practice correlate within each of those upayas. Starting with what is called the darshana, the view. So all religions have a view. Some religions think their view is better than others. That's not a debate we're here to have, right? It's not important to us. But what I will say is that there are views that are the exploration of non-dual consciousness, the non-dual reality, and traditions that explore duality. The fundamental difference is the difference between one and two, because two means more than one. Non-dual tradition discusses that there is only one pure consciousness, and everything is expressing and unfolding and is a manifestation of that consciousness. That even our individual life, even our thoughts, even our emotions, even our body aches and pains, all are part of that fundamental play of consciousness. The upayas, which you can really think of them as the stages of our practice. The upayas, in correlation to the practices that we do in each of those stages, is how that unfolding takes place. It's how the unfolding of our own dualistic consciousness unfolds and reveals itself within a unified field of consciousness. Those three upayas, I describe them as the triadic path to liberation. Upayas are at once the means that we move through, the means that we adopt, the focusing of our own individual consciousness, and at the same time, the state of our consciousness as Shiva. And so when we get our little report card, oh, we're in this stage or that stage, all it's saying, one isn't better than the other. It's saying the state of our own identification, the state of our own recognition that we are that pure consciousness is either little or big. And in some ways, you can think of the upayas as that, as a little bit awareness that we are that pure consciousness, or a really big awareness, all the way to the point where there's no sense of stage in the first place. The reason that we call this Kundalini Sadhana and the upayas is that there is a direct and specific correlation between the arousal or activation of Kundalini within us the awakening of Kundalini within us and the liberation of Kundalini within us. And there's a direct correlation between that and the transformation of our experience of being separate to one of not being separate. The transformation of our individual identity, our limited individual identity that we somehow are trapped in, and that because we're trapped in that, there is some sense of failure in our life. There's some sense of suffering. Those all correlate together. These wisdom teachings from which I study and have extracted from, what's important to understand about them is that these were not a bunch of jocks getting together and writing out a play. Oh, hey, we'll do this and this, and we'll say it happens like that, right? These wisdom teachings began to be expressed in written language, again, around the 8th or 9th century, and matured through that period until about the 13th century, if you will, until the Muslim incursion into India, into Asia. But those teachings, that philosophy, if you will, were not some made-up theory. They were the experience of people like you and me who sat down and closed their eyes and discovered something in themselves. And then they wrote it down because they didn't have, recorders and cameras and live streaming and stuff like that at the time, right? At least in the form we know of it, right? So as we go through the process, there may be some discussion, some language that your brain might say, well, this sounds a little too philosophical, or it sounds like philosophy to me. It is philosophy until you find it in your own experience. And this is the singular reason why I teach from that perspective as well as my own experience, because as I began to study scripture, then I recognized my own experience in what these truly great ancient inner scientists had said, this is my experience. And some of the greatest saints that ever lived on this planet in this tradition were obviously far more advanced than me, far more articulate in their experience and their capacity to articulate that experience. And we're grateful for that. All of this tradition, which you can throw in the bucket called Kashmir Shaivism, in which there are a number of different schools, all of it really represent the extraordinary inner experience, the subtlety of conscious exploration within these great masters, within these individuals who, through their inner exploration, if you will, became great masters because of the recognition they had in themselves. All of this text, all this language, all this extraordinary tradition was really lost. It was lost to the world. There, I'm sure, have been places, again, since the Muslim incursion in the 13th century, then everything went underground. Went into caves, it went into basements, right? It became secret. And ever since that time, then the authentic practices from which these traditions arose and maybe the oral exploration or discussion of those traditions automatically had to be repressed because it wasn't a good idea to say them. Those practices never went away. But it was only in the early 1970s that people, they began to be, the archaeologists of spiritual literature began to find these extraordinary texts. It's like Raiders of the Lost Ark, finding these extraordinary treasures. And slowly began to uncover them, slowly began to translate them. They weren't in English or Spanish. And it's still now only beginning to be uncovered, truly uncovered. And this all truly started not by practitioners, but by scholars. Academics who explored religion and tradition, and through looking at this one, saw some reference to some 9th century text, Malini Vijaya Tantra, which is actually older than that. Well, who's that? Right? What's that about? So they began to put on their boots and their hats and to dig in and find these scripture. And most of it was in fact found in Kashmir, hidden in temples, buried, etc. And that's why it originally was called Kashmir Shaivism. And that was one of the true seats of where this spiritual revolution, if you will, began, where the non-dual tradition began to take place. So these academics, if you will, began to do research and discover this. And today there are many people doing it. There's probably 4 or 5 people on the planet that truly are masters at that. Alexis Sanderson is one of them. Our friend Harish Christopher Wallace is doing an extraordinary job with that. A dear friend of mine, Mark Dishkovsky, who lives in Varanasi. These are the 3 that I know personally and that have done a great service to us, beginning to extract and to translate these texts. And there are others, as I said. And now many practitioners have begun to study those. Teachers have begun to use them. And I only say that to you because throughout the course, the practice that I teach of Kundalini sadhana is I am articulated through the context of these ancient traditions, which were in fact articulating the practice of Kundalini sadhana. One last thing I'll say about that is that non-dual tantric practices are not about sex, unfortunately. They're about the exploration of consciousness. They're non-dual tantric practices, and another thing I'll say is that tantric practices primarily focus on the energetic mechanism, on the chakras, the central channel, and if you will, the awakening of Kundalini. All of these practices that began to be at least publicized in the 8th or 9th century were really a reaction to the dualistic practices of the time, the orthodox practices of dualism, who the teachings were, in a simplistic way, we're saying there's God and there's you. There's you and the world. You're separate from the world. You're separate from God. And somehow this didn't quite gel with some of these little 17, 18-year-old yogis and yoginis. And so they went and sat down somewhere, and they closed their eyes, and they realized that wasn't true. That they were discovering that unity in themselves. They were discovering that they were not separate from their own life, as they had been told. That they're not separate from the world, that their life in the world is not an illusion, that their life in the world is not separate from its own source, which is pure consciousness. This was an inner discovery. And that is what we do in a practice such as we're discussing and exploring here. All wisdom teaching, any teaching, I will say this real straight up front, is meaningless to any of us if we don't find it in our own experience. In so many ways, teaching is their road signs. That might be your experience. Oh, that might be your experience. And as I read, just like anything, these wisdom teachings, even as little of it has been excavated, if you will, there's still volumes and volumes and volumes of it. And what is being discovered as these texts are being uncovered and translated is the level of detail, the level of, we'll say, minutia, that those yogis of ancient Ur began to understand and write down was limitless. Again, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have emails, they didn't have Netflix, so all they did was sit around and meditate, and then instead of saying it's blue, then they discovered the 50 shades of blue, and they would describe that. That's lovely if you have the time. But it's enough to see blue and to see that, yes, blue has many shades. So so none of you get up and run out of the room, I want to be clear, we're not going to explore the level of minutia that we could. There are other people who are much more adept at that, and as myself anyhow. What you'll find as we have this discussion is I, again, use what some much smarter person than me might have written down about their experience that correlates with my own. And that's why I have married, if you will, the within my own teaching, this wisdom teachings with the internal practices that can point us towards an experience that's available to us. And they're all pointing to one experience. And that one experience is liberation. The singular purpose of Kundalini sadhana, the singular purpose of all of the great non-dual traditions, and whatever their particular means and practices that they implore, is first the singular purpose, so that we each as individuals can know the God that dwells within ourselves as ourself. I will straight up say, I always have to do this as we begin a program like this, is that I'm going to use the many names for God interchangeably. God, Shiva, Goddess, etc. Because for me, the word God never had the connotation it might have had for some of you. And if that term, using that, offends you, well, I'm sorry. But just know that for me, when I speak about God, use that term. And to be honest, it's the term that most resonates with me, in me, that somehow speaks to that pure, simple awareness that is myself, that is my source. But so God, Shiva, Goddess, don't, they're all interchangeable. So don't be confused by that, right? Whether it's God, Shiva, or Joe, we're talking about the pure consciousness that exists within ourselves and from which we manifested. The same pure consciousness that exists within all manifestation. And that is liberation. That direct recognition that we are pure consciousness. And the upayas are a discussion of that progression. Now, the upayas are often discussed as a non-linear progression, and yet they seem to be. I at least describe them as there's a continuum, and the non-linearity of them means that any one of them can take us to God. Any one of them can free our individual consciousness to recognize itself as pure consciousness. We can also say they're nonlinear in the sense that, so we if you think of my first, second, and third grade, right, that sometimes when we get to the third grade, we misbehave. And then we have to learn some of the things we learned in the first grade. I use the first, second, and third grade because we all know, we have a few teachers in our midst, that anybody past the third grade, they all know everything anyhow, so they're not going to relearn anything. So I call this the heart of consciousness. And you'll hear as we discuss this throughout whatever part of the program you're in, that when is the heart of consciousness is the term that I use for pure consciousness. You'll also see that the heart of consciousness is that there's our own heart, our own awareness. There's our own awareness that we discover within that unified field, meaning we're not separate from that unified field. And then there's just that simple, pure, unified field. And so that's called, I call that the triadic heart. And in that, what we're describing is the expansion of our own limited consciousness into universal consciousness. I'm going to say most of what I'm saying right now a couple of hundred times, so it's okay if you don't quite get it. And there'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions and discuss this in depth. So each of the sessions we will have a discussion. There'll be a handout that I will follow with you. We'll do a meditation. Then there will also be, and you should have, for those of you who aren't here, it's one of the two PDFs that you get. There's homework that I'm going to give each of you. And that's mostly, a short reading, 3, 5, 6 pages. That'll be a primer for the discussion we're going to have next week. And then the first thing we'll do starting next week is we'll take the test, right? Because we love tests. All right. Would anyone like to ask a question about what I've said so far in terms of the process or the general introduction? Then what we're going to do now is meditate, and I'll guide you through a simple meditation as we go through. And Reed, do we have the bell? I'm sorry, the gong. Sorry, I should have asked for it. So the meditation will be 20 to 25 minutes, depending on how quickly you start fidgeting. And when it's time, I'll ring the bell, and then we'll further our conversations. So close your eyes now. Thank you, Reed. Sorry, I should have mentioned it to you before. So just try to sit up straight. Your body should be relaxed, but you're sitting in a chair. Feet should be on the ground. Thumb and forefingers together, palms facing up. And just become aware of your breath. And just follow the arising and subsiding of the breath. You notice how the arising of the breath emerges out of a still point, arises, and then subsides back into that still point. And as you follow that, notice that the place from which the breath arises and subsides is your own awareness. And you can notice that that still point, that center from which the breath arises and subsides, is in the center of your own heart. And just let your awareness be in that still point. And the arising and the subsiding of the breath becomes more the arising and subsiding of pulsation. Pulsation of your consciousness. And you'll notice that the duration of the arising and the duration of the subsiding seems to be longer and longer. And as you rest in that still point, notice that any boundary that might have been a sense there of the arising or the subsiding diminishes. And as the awareness arises and subsides, at the end of that subsiding, let go. So we'll proceed. If does anybody need a bio break, then we won't take one. So if you will turn your page, your first page. Then I'll read you this first page on the left, which is kind of put into the language, the whole discussion that we're going to have all year. It says, our life is divinely offered to us as a means to liberation. Sadhana of the heart is the journey into the possibility of freedom, love, and joy. Bless you. Ignorance of our true self is the cause of all suffering and endless transmigration, while the recognition and direct experience of our true identity is alone the cause of freedom from separation. As human beings, we experience suffering because we perceive and believe ourselves to be separate from our own source, or divine consciousness. Due to Shaktipada, the descent of grace, the longing for liberation springs forth from our own heart, igniting the search for ourselves in God's heart. Through Kundalini Sadhana, the sadhana of the heart, we surrender to the Shakti, the energy, pulsating within us as the true agency of action. As we come to reside in the heart of consciousness, we recognize ourselves as pure consciousness, or Shiva. Our life is transformed into an expression and celebration of unconditional freedom, love, and joy. Whatever spiritual practice you do, you might even do this one, you may not. Always keep in the clarity of your own awareness why you're doing that. And that is for liberation. That is to be free of suffering. It is to directly experience the pure joy of our own awareness, of our own existence. It is to come in contact with, to establish ourselves in that place of freedom, in that unbounded, simple state of unconditionality. This is the purpose of sadhana. It's not to relieve our aches and pains. It's not necessarily to change our life. It is to change our consciousness. I will say, at least it's been my experience, that it is a journey of a lifetime. And a journey that a lifetime without that journey for me is meaningless. So this introduction sutra statement is setting the stage that I want you to always come back to in our discussions here, in your meditation, in your own practice, whatever that might be, in your daily awareness of what we're doing, what the purpose of our life is, why we have been divinely offered this life. And you'll see as we move through the process shortly how that divine offering takes place. You'll see that when we talk about Shaktipata, this descent of grace, how that email that we get that reminds us the purpose of our life, that activates the clarity of our purpose, is an extraordinary gift, and one that our sadhana is the response to. And if we can do this, then all the hubble and bubble, the toil and trouble, is just part of what we go through as that unfolding takes place, as some of our limited understandings gets pressed up against our face a little bit. Because let's be clear, that's what's really happening. As this unfolding takes place, our own limited understanding, which is in fact the cause of our suffering, that limited understanding gets revealed. Because God doesn't suffer. The goddess doesn't suffer. She's groovy. Everything is just the way it should be. What we want to discover in our life is that that's also true. And that all of the hubbub, all of the drama, all of the pain, etc., is our misunderstanding, not the reality of our own life. And this also is one of the really important things about non-dual tantric practices, is in that statement, in that understanding, we're not rejecting life. We're embracing life as to understand that our life is in fact the field in which our freedom is revealed. We're not spiritual ostriches. We don't just stick our head in the hole in the sand and say, yeah, well, everything's groovy, right? With our eyes wide open, in this apparent duality, in the face of all this diversity, looking at all that multiplicity, we discover that there's only one thing, and that is the pure joy of consciousness. This is a life-affirming tradition. It is a life-affirming practice, not in any way a rejection of anything. Which doesn't mean as we develop the subtlety of consciousness that we can taste the difference between salt and sugar. That we don't salt our food when we want to add sugar, etc. That we discover unity in the diversity. We penetrate through the duality that we seem to live in to find the field of unity in which all that diversity is expressing itself. You'll see as we talk about this. This is in fact the categoric clarity of Shiva and Shakti. Shiva, another word for Shiva, is consciousness. Shakti is energy. In our life, the life of the birds and the bees, the life of Pluto, the life of the entire cosmos, the life of the universes we can't see, are the manifest expression of that consciousness through its power to do so, through its Shakti. And in that act, if you will, that pure consciousness never loses contact with itself as all those things. because it's not expressed outside of itself. It's expressed within itself, within its own field of awareness. And that's the fundamental distinction between our experience and what God's having. So you'll see we're going to discuss the matrix of sadhana and the means to liberation. And you're going to turn the page and you're going to see this really complicated looking graph, which isn't that complicated. And we're not going to go through this in full detail. But the reason I have it here is that we're going to be discussing all of these different boxes that populate this matrix in some detail. You'll see that the chart on the left and the graph on the right are saying the same thing. So I'll give you the overview of this. So the top section where it says the matrix of sadhana and the means to liberation, and it shows the upayas across the right, Anavapaya, Shaktopaya, and Shambhavapaya. That in the white box underneath it that says the unfolding of the heart of consciousness, and on the left says darshana. That section there primarily is what we're going to talk about in this module in these 3 or 4 weeks. But keep in mind that so that's called the darshana, and the darshana of non-dual practices that focus on the understanding of this unfolding of consciousness within our experience, called the upayas, that happens in this progressive stages, called Anavapaya, Shaktopaya, and Shambhavapaya. Anavapaya means the path of effort, specifically the path of individual effort. And we'll come to understand what the effort be, what we do. The Shaktopaya is called the path of energy. It's also called sometimes the path of mind or the path of knowledge. But it's the path of energy because we are surrendering to the Shakti. We're surrendering to that energy that emoted itself, that arose out of consciousness to express individuality. But we're discovering in our own individuality that Shakti, that which is called Kundalini within us. And we're surrendering to that Shakti. And in that process, a revelation takes place. An awakening takes place. An expansion of our own individual consciousness starts to unfold. In Shambhavapaya, which is called the path of awareness, it's also called, as you'll find out, the path of Shiva. So we're talking about Shiva's awareness. And we want to come in contact with that, experience, have a direct recognition of that, and reside in that. Now, if that third upaya says that's Shiva's awareness, well, what the dang happened to ours? Well, we traded up. What really has happened is that our own awareness, in its limited capacity to know itself, expands and recognizes itself as unlimited awareness. That our awareness is Shiva's awareness. We just don't know it. So it's not that we get a new awareness when we hit stage 3. It's that we recognize our own awareness is not different from Shiva's awareness. That's called liberation. Because as the little ditty that we just read says, it's our own awareness, it's our own misunderstanding that causes us to suffer. Shiva do not suffer. So these stages are the fundamental progression of our own life, and the fundamental progression of our own life that starts from God calling us home. That's called Shaktipada, and we'll discuss that in depth. So that whole top box down to the bold line is really what we're going to talk about in this first module. The next box, where it says on the left, the practice of Kundalini sadhana, and the caption across the top is the direct experience of energy and consciousness. What we're really talking about is the different aspects within our practices within each of those upayas, and if you will, the effect. So if you look, for example, where it says surrender and stillness, the letting go that frees awareness. What you will discover as we discuss this, and what you may or may not have discovered in your own sadhana, and what you hopefully will as you move forward, is that the letting go that frees awareness has stages. That what the awareness that's freed up in a Navapaya is, I won't say different from, but not as full blown as the awareness that's freed up in Shambhavapaya. So in these successive modules that we do, they will be focused on Navapaya, Shaktapaya, and Shambhavapaya. And so each of these practices on the left, we will discuss each of those in context of that particular upaya. And there will be corresponding meditations and practices that will be given as part of that. This is, by the way, a manual for liberation. So it has to have a little bit of detail. In that same process, you'll see the next box on the left says the conduct of Kundalini sadhana. Well, whose conduct are we talking about? Not Shiva's. Oh yeah, it is Shiva's. Wait a minute, I'm so confused now. If you will, the effect of our practices. The transformation of our moment-to-moment expression and consciousness of ourself. And part of the dynamic interchange between, if you will, our life and our own consciousness. The dynamic interchange where our life is not separate from our consciousness, and our conduct is changed. We go from being bad doobies to good doobies. Now, please, I want you to say this is not beginning to set up a bunch of dogma and rules. How each of us, the conduct that each of us has is not something that is preset or predetermined or measured. I'm suggesting to you some overall changes in your own experience that you might experience as you move through these upayas. The very bottom box says the realization of Kundalini sadhana. The realization of the Kundalini sadhana is the same as the darshana. Where you begin is where you end up. Liberation, the direct recognition of our own divinity. And you'll see some specific boxes down there that look like, whoa, I mean, I got to do that. But you'll see the very bottom 3 boxes says that the upayas correspond to one thing, which is the freedom from limited, separated identity, the misunderstanding that we are a limited, separate identity. And so it says, a Navapaya is when we begin to recognize that we live in a place of consciousness that believes itself to be completely separate from God, from its own source. And everything we do, act, feel, project, scream about, happens from that place of misunderstanding. And we begin to recognize that so that we can begin to change that. And the next box over says non-separated identity. The Sanskrit term is called Purusha, where we, through the practice of Kundalini sadhana, recognize that we are an individuated expression of divine consciousness. And this is an extraordinarily important milestone in the awakening of our own consciousness. Because without that experience, without that recognition, then the next box over, the identity of oneness, doesn't take place. We don't go from just being Joe to being God. We recognize I'm Joe, and then we recognize I'm Joe, but I'm also God. And then we recognize I am God. Pretty simple, right? So this little bit sophisticated chart is helping us to understand the depth of subtlety that we'll be exploring in our own sadhana. And whatever time it takes us to move through these upayas, I will tell you, is more than this year. So at the end of the year, if you continue through this whole year, you'll have your own manual for liberation so that you don't have to come back and do this course with me again year after year. What happens, when you have to get reaccredited, right? We don't have that, right? That's a money-making venture. So the graph on the right, if you will, is another way of expressing that. It says, so the outside circle says the light of the heart, which is the darshana. The light of the heart is non-dual tantric tradition saying that all of life is simply pure consciousness, expressing itself out of its unbounded joy. It is an autonomous freedom, and it expresses itself out of that freedom. As you move around the circle, it says the sadhana of the heart, the actuation of freedom. That corresponds to this whole center section in the matrix on the left. It is the upayas. What we're doing is actuating the freedom that is inherent within us through our sadhana, through these means and the practices inherent within those means. And then, because we do that, then we come to what says the recognition of the heart, the knower of freedom. That, by the way, is Shambhavapaya in its more mature state. And that is not different from the light of the heart. So we've come full circle. Would anybody like to ask an overview question about this? Yes, please.
So there's will, knowledge, and action. So how do those relate to the to Anandapaya, Shaktapaya, or do they relate? Are they one-to-one correspond?
Ad nauseum, they relate. And
Are they one-to-one correspond?
yes and no. You don't have to re-ask it, but yeah. So we need to use the mic from now on the question so that people can hear it. But in fact, what you're going to see in the next Monday night session is a specific discussion of will, knowledge, and action. There are actually 5 powers that we'll be discussing, right? But yes, you can pretty much say that will, knowledge, and action correspond to each of the 3 upayas, but they all 3 function within all 3 of the upayas, again, with a different level of understanding, right? Is that helpful? Is that, yeah. So if you just turn your page. So I've blown up that first top section just so it's clear that what we're really talking about in this module is primarily the things in the white box. And we won't be in depth correlating them to the upayas, even though you'll see how they do fit. Mostly what we're trying to really understand is the view of non-dual tantric tradition. What we're really trying to do is get it through our heads right now that there is this simple non-dual consciousness, and that coming to know that, coming to experience that is the purpose of our sadhana. But that is the view. We're not trying to prove our own separation here. We've already done that lifetime after lifetime. We're trying to, if you will, to prove, to discover in ourselves that non-separation. You know that what you eat, you are. The Beatles said it. We're not here to prove that we're separate from God. We are here to understand that we are not. And so the view, my teaching of this practice, of non-dual practices, tradition, is that there is only one simple pure consciousness of which we are an individuated expression of, and we're not separate from that. So that's why understanding the view of whatever practice you should enter into, whatever tradition you should enter into. Perhaps you have entered into a different tradition in the past that had a different view. But again, what we're trying to really be careful is that we're not suggesting a dogma. Throughout the entire process, what I will be encouraging you is to not believe a word I say, but to discover what I might be alluding to in yourself, and then you'll know if it's true or not. Because it's not true until you know it in yourself. But that is the purpose of wisdom tradition. It is the purpose of teachings, is to suggest to us something different than we might know. Suggest to us to look for some other place. As Rumi said, haven't you been stoned long enough? Try something different. Now, all of us that were born at a certain point always add a D to the word stone. Haven't you been stoned long enough? Right. What he was, of course, saying is, haven't we misunderstood long enough? You know what stone means?
That was what I thought you said.
Everybody makes the mistake. Right. Haven't we been rock long enough? Haven't we lived in this concrete density of our own consciousness long enough? Let's try something different. I'm sorry, Cicely, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I did.
Hold on, we got a mic here. We're going to have you know what we need, guys? We need a drone, like that the mic can be attached to.
Quick question on the very bottom box.
I don't know why we can't have a mic that works.
Okay. Oh, that's on.
Just
Okay.
lower it a touch.
Like that. Okay.
Yeah.
So on the very bottom box, I was just curious about the non-separate identity or Purusha and the identity of oneness God. And I'm just wondering, are they simultaneous? I mean, like once you get Purusha, do you have the awareness of God?
No, but you have the possibility.
Okay.
Look, they're all simultaneous. Separated identity is simultaneous with the unity of God, of consciousness. They're all happening within one field of awareness, within God consciousness. So the point is, it is the transformation, the unfolding of our limited experience into an unlimited experience. But that's what I was suggesting, that it's like I talk about Purusha as climbing to the top of the mountain where you can jump up. Right? Right. So, but it's only when we get to the top of the mountain that we have the 360 view, that we can see everything and we can have a whole different perspective. And we could actually probably surrender our limited perspective. It's like if we go up into space and we look back down, you always hear how astronauts say, yeah, it wasn't what I thought it was, right? Because their view is different, right? Is that helpful? Good. Sorry, I didn't mean to ignore your question. All right. So if you will turn the page, again, we're just kind of setting up the discussion. As I mentioned earlier, and the reason I call this our entire practice the heart of consciousness is that it is really about the unfolding of our own heart. It's about the unfolding of our own consciousness. That is what sadhana is all about. So these little boxes, again, are part of the view that say to us, the highest power in the heart of consciousness is its own freedom. The highest power in God's own consciousness is the power of his own freedom. Now that's a bold statement, but might suggest to us to be clear of the extraordinary power in our own heart. Extraordinary power in our own heart to discover the freedom that is inherent within us. And that, in fact, it is through our own heart, which we first locate in the heart chakra. But it is through our own awareness that we discover that truth. That graph on the other said, the knower of freedom. Well, God is the knower of freedom. We be the knower of non-freedom, at least for a while. The power of awareness that resides in the heart provides the possibility of a return to consciousness. Meaning, if that awareness that we can find, just as we, in a simple way, did in our meditation, if that awareness was not already within us, where would it be and how could we find it? Because we can come in contact in just a simple way, feel that openness in our heart, that gives us the insight to know that that power exists within us. You'll notice in the meditation, I didn't say, feel the pillar on your left. Feel the grain. Feel the burn marks where somebody put their cigarette out. We're not discovering something outside of ourselves. We're discovering the power of consciousness within us to know consciousness. This is a fundamental teaching of non-dual practices. We will never, ever, never, ever, ever discover it anywhere but inside ourselves. So I have, in a simple way, have described those upayas in that bottom box that says, the journey to God. Just feel your heart. If you can feel your heart, you're feeling God. You'll notice it doesn't say feel your mind, because you cannot feel God in your mind. The journey to God, the journey in God, and the journey as God. The journey in God, merging our heart with God's. You'll remember that Shaktopai is also the path of energy. But we are in our surrender to that energy. We recognize that we are not separate from that energy, and that energy is not separate from its source, which is Shiva. So we just be walking hand in hand with God. But there's still some sense that me and God are walking. But we're inside that Shakti. We're inside that surrender to that state. And the journey is God. We're living in the oneness of God's heart. Now, this sounds like a little bit like a nice Hallmark card. Well, it would be a nice Hallmark card. We'll get some nice graphic artist to do a cover thing, and this can be what it inside. We'll make millions, or at least $20, because all of you guys will buy one. I'll make sure you do. Right. I'm putting this chart here because you're going to hear me endlessly discuss the heart of God. You'll see, as I make references to some of these great ancient scripture and these great ancient masters, how they talk about that pure consciousness as heart. And for me, in my own personal sadhana, it's always been about my heart. From the moment I met my teacher, and the heart that I didn't know I had opened, exploded onward. But that heart is our consciousness. But what many of you practice with me already know, when your heart's open, feel a little better than when it's not. Bless
I'm
you.
gonna go sit in the back.
Please.
No, I think I'm allergic to something.
Okay. Sorry. So turn your page, please. So this is beginning to get into one more level of delineation or understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about consciousness. And what we're talking about when we talk about Shiva and Shakti. Shiva and Shakti being two sides of the same coin. On one side, there's a male figure, and on the other side, there's a female figure. Shiva and Shakti. God and Goddess. But what's important, and what I hope I will do as we go through this entire process, is to help you understand what this means to you. And if I go through a particular session and I somehow haven't done that, then throw something at me and say, what the hell does this mean to me? Please do. Not all at once, but all right. So this discussion of Prakasha and Vimarsha is fundamental in the view of non-dual practices. It is the dynamic aspect of Shiva and Shakti. It says, Prakasha and Vimarsha. Prakasha is the divine consciousness that illuminates all of life. Vimarsha is the self-reflective capacity of divine consciousness to know itself. The divine consciousness that illuminates all of life. What is that saying to us? It is saying to us that consciousness shines forth and in that shining forth, life expresses itself, that it is expressing itself as life, and it's expressing itself as existence, if you will. It's not that existence is over there and God takes a flashlight and says, oh, there it is. It's saying that inherent in life itself is the consciousness that gives life to consciousness. We use the word illuminate because that's what it's doing. It's illuminating its own existence. Some tradition even talks about this as the light of consciousness. In fact, maybe that's what what my little graph said back there. I can't remember. Let's see if it says. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The light of consciousness, the light of the heart. No difference. Right. But it's not enough. Shiva is not inert. Consciousness is not inert. It knows itself as consciousness. The term is Vimarsha, the self-reflective capacity to know itself as consciousness. And this is really, 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 really important to you and to me because we have that same capacity within us. We have the capacity, because we're conscious, to know ourselves as consciousness. That same dynamic power, interchangeable power, is what gives each of us the capacity to change our consciousness, which is what's really happening as we move through the upayas. What's really happening in that capacity to change our consciousness is our capacity to recognize our state of consciousness, to recognize ourselves as being a little tense, as wrapped too tight for New Orleans. What if you just were a blithering, crazy, mad person all the time, but you didn't know it? What would happen? What?
You'd be elected president.
Or somebody would kill you. But yes, unfortunately, only one of those persons can be elected president at a time. Right, right. What? That's exactly right. The point being is that because we have the capacity to recognize our state, we can change it. That self-reflective capacity, called Vimarsha, is the active principle, the active power of consciousness to know itself as consciousness. It's not enough to be the light bulb. We have to know that we're the light bulb. It's like watching the sunrise and knowing that we're the cause of the sunrise. while we're enjoying that sunrise. Everything happens within the field of consciousness. And our sadhana is to bring us to that experience. And this discussion of Prakasha and Vimarsha is the transformative agent within our own consciousness for that to take place. I can sit up here, somebody else can sit up here, somebody else in some other room can sit up there and talk to you forever about what maybe even their experience. They can lay out lovely discussions. It's meaningless if we can't discover that truth that might somehow we have a whiff, yeah, that might be true. It's meaningless if it's not true in us, if we can't discover that truth in us. And this dynamic capacity of consciousness to know itself is that active agent. And it is the same consciousness, the same capacity to know our state that we utilize every moment of our day if we have an authentic spiritual practice. We're going to talk a lot about Shakti and Kundalini and raising the energy and feeling someplace above your head and someplace next to Lafayette, right? And all of that's part of the process of discovering that we be here and in Lafayette at the same time. That's all happening within the field of pure consciousness. And that everything that unfolds out of consciousness does not diminish God's knowing of himself as God and as all things that are expressing itself. The term is Bhairava. That's another term for Rudra, or another term for Shiva, God who knows himself as all things. So this entire manifest expression does not diminish consciousness's capacity to know itself as consciousness, meaning that all of the apparent diversity, all the multiplicity is the expression of that unity, not something that's happening different or separate or outside of it. And in fact, what we discover by penetrating through that diversity, through that multiplicity, we discover oneness. Those powers of will, knowledge, and action in their pure state is the emission that creates the universe. It's the same emission that creates each of us. That power to do so is called Svatantriya, and we'll talk about that in the next session. That autonomous power of pure consciousness has the same autonomous capacity to know itself as that consciousness. This is the fundamental canon of non-dual practices. And the reason we talk about it in the view is that if we don't look for that, we won't find it. If we don't look to discover that simple, pure state of pure joy in us, we will find something else. Okay, let's be fair. Sometimes, and even in looking for pure joy, we find other things. And what part of us finds those other things or recognizes those other things is that vimarsha, is that self-reflective capacity. Does that make sense? So you're going to hear me coming back to this over and over and over again, that self-reflective capacity. And what you're going to hear me talk about a lot as we move through the upayas is in fact that it is the uncovering of limited self-reflective capacity, which is in essence what our sadhana is about. When we talk about Anavapaya, the path of effort, and the different practices that we're doing there, what we're beginning to do is to turn ourselves inside and to be able to recognize this limited state of awareness that we function from. And we can only do so because that capacity already exists within us. And that every level of consciousness will have a discussion of what are called the tattvas. It'll be a short discussion. It could be 10 years long. But that every level of consciousness has that pure consciousness in it, but its capacity to know itself as pure consciousness is limited. That's called sentience. So the term Purusha that we talked about earlier is a level of consciousness within us that can recognize itself as not being different from God. That recognizes itself as being an individuated expression of God. Whereas the level of consciousness that we call ego, we'll call him Igor. What would be the feminine name for Igor? Igorini, right? That it is the level of consciousness that we call ego and its device called mind that has no capacity to recognize itself as anything but separate and does everything it can do to defend that separateness. And so sadhana is freedom from ego. That's what the bottom little box said. That's the fundamental shift that must take place in our sadhana. We're not killing the ego. We're not burying it. We're not denying it. We're recognizing that's my ego. And only because we have the capacity to know our own state can we recognize that's my ego, and we can put down the sledgehammer that we're about to use to somehow try to demolish our own life because we somehow believe it's not our life or that somebody else is doing something in our life. So that self-reflective capacity is the fundamental aspect of consciousness that we are unfolding, or you can say we're allowing to unfold within us, because the highest state of that vimarsha is consciousness knowing itself as consciousness. So I'm going to stop. You can read the little ditty there later, right? And I'll see if there's any questions about this. So microphone, please. Enter and sign in, please.
So, what it makes sense to me to think of it this way, that Shiva's playing a game with himself, and he says, "Okay, I could become manifest in that one, and even in that one, I could still remember that I am Shiva."
Perfect. Therein is the lesson.
Okay.
Yes. That's sometimes in tradition called the play of consciousness. Just to add to that, sometimes that's discussed as Shiva in deciding to manifest, specifically to decide to manifest as an individual, forgets that he's that individual. And why would God do that? He's all powerful. Why would he do that? For the fun and the joy of remembering. The joy of remembering. And so, but yes, fundamentally, just that is what is taking place. We be walking with this body and this mind and these emotions, et cetera, because God chose to walk as us. And there are billions of people on the planet that walk around and don't know that. That because that grace has not descended back into its own consciousness and says, remember who you are, then that longing has not taken place. And that's why Shaktipada is so extraordinary to understand for each of us, that anybody sitting in a room like this with anybody weirdo like me, right, is there because of grace. And every tradition talks about that. The difference in this tradition, non-dual tantric tradition, is that there are very specific things that take place that activate that journey back home within us, right? But yes, fundamentally that's it. And so if that's true, even if we can write ourselves the Post-it note, take the soap and write it on our mirror, I'm really just God. Wouldn't it be joyful to know that? How different would our life be if that was the inquiry we went through our life trying to discover?
Or if the purpose of my life is to help God remember himself.
Then we're serving God. And not doing it is rejecting even God. Yes. Beautiful. Ty,
It's a sequel to this.
please.
How do you know
Hold on a second. Somehow it goes on and off.
Okay.
I think it times itself out. Go ahead.
I think the question that interests me is the purpose. I conceptually can relate to everything.
Have what?
I can conceptually
Right.
relate to everything. But if it is a question of knowing that there is unity in diversity, what is the purpose of creating that diversity?
For the purpose of creating diversity, of creating multiplicity, is expansion. And for the simple joy of doing so. Look, God's sitting up there, it's just pure white light, and he says, man, I'd like to just be able to walk. Wouldn't it be more fun to just walk rather than laying here in this pure white, still joyful place, right? It is the natural, organic expression of the abundance of joy within consciousness. And the thing that's hard for us to grok is that all of this expression is the expression of that joy, even though some of it doesn't look very joyful. But from God's perspective, it's the joy of being. It's the joy of creative expression. And that fullness, if you will, is so full within God, within that pure consciousness, that it just overflowed. That's the purpose of life. Is that helpful? Conceptually.
Takes a while to digest this.
It does, yes. Yes.
So also following her question, I've always wondering, so why are we as human special that we have the capacity to realize God, then how about other sentient beings?
It is expressed that human beings have the capacity to become to become divine, to recognize their divinity, whereas other sentient beings don't have that capacity to recognize their divinity. Now, is that true or not true? I'd say at least since we're humans, let's adopt that policy, right? Right. But that, and it's a very important question, but it's only important. What I think is important about it is to recognize we can transform our consciousness. We can recognize our own divinity. And perhaps in doing so, we might recognize maybe, quote, lower forms of sentient beings already know it. That we're the only level of sentient being that didn't know it, right? Because only, maybe we're the only ones that have this thing called an ego that gets it wrong, right? Right. We have a little puppy, little toy poodle. His name is Dakshi, which means the glorious one. And the funnest thing is that anytime you see him, whether you've been gone 3 days, 3 months, or 3 minutes, is the pure joy that he has of seeing you. That just this, he's just jumping up and down. I mean, many people who have animals, the same thing, but there's just that pure joy there, right? What if we just jumped up and down with the joy of our life every time we saw even our parents, right? So I think the important thing is to just be grateful that yes, we have the capacity and therefore the possibility to know our own divinity. Go ahead.
And another question maybe related to this is always a question in my mind that, and also in my experience, that sometimes God is not only the pure consciousness, sometimes God is personal. It sometimes take form like a person. And how do you reconcile or combine this more philosophical idea of God and the more personal, or in a sense, more occult idea of God?
Well, what I would say to that is that there is no conflict between God being nowhere and God being in you. And that's the place where we free ourselves from any sense that there would be a conflict, right? God expresses itself in every person, like see in every little poodle, right? And in every star, right? We just can't see that because of our limited capacity to understand, right? So then we can dismiss the sense of conflict between those things, right? Even the person looking at us that we say we love and says they love us and are spitting at us, vomiting their attention on us, that's still God. Now, okay, it may take us a little while to get past that, but there is only that pure consciousness expressing itself in all multiple forms. And truly what we're truly wanting to do is to be able to see and know that. And on one sense, saying, well, how arrogant of us that we should want to know that. But we already know it. And that's why we have the capacity to know that. And that's at the same time the challenge of looking at the world, at looking at the people in the world, looking at the horrific things that people do to each other in this world, and say, isn't God wonderful?
Yeah.
But it's true. And there is a moment in your sadhana that you will recognize that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're going to stop. Is there any burning questions? Probably more burning need to go pee. So we're going to stop and close our eyes for 1 minute. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's been truly sweet and wonderful to be here. And if you think so, I hope I'll see you again next week. Good night.